just to lay a little bit of foundation for those who may not be as familiar with this trial or where it comes from or what it is. Last year, Penguin Random House put in the winning bid for Simon & Schuster. And for those who don't know, Simon & Schuster is owned by a media company in the US, Viacom, which doesn't want to be in the book business any longer. Penguin Random House is owned by Bertelsmann, which is primarily focused on books based in Germany. So when PRH was the winning bidder, the government started investigating it in the US, and they brought an antitrust case on the basis of harm not to consumers or readers specifically, but to authors, who are those who supply the publishers. So that makes it a pretty unique case. That's a very new approach, I believe, as a legal matter. We're not going to get into the legal details. We're really here to discuss what we learned from the case, how authors might be affected by it. And the question I'm going to start with is something unique to this case, which is this isn't about advances for all authors. The government's case focuses on anticipated top-selling books, ATSB, which are, as defined by the government, books earning advances $250,000 or higher, and showing how advances would go down for this sector of the market. So the opening question I want to start with is, if you think the government was successful in making this particular case, and why or why not? And I'm going to start with Howard. Oh, who dropped off? Oh no. Suspense and tension already. Okay, so let's go to Guy, because I know that I think he's probably well prepared. I've seen him tweeting about this, and maybe he has some thoughts. I'll put you right on the spot there.
All right. Yeah, this was kind of fun to follow because I was actually on vacation throughout the trial. So, and completely another country. But my take on it is that I think the DOJ did as good a job as they could with the constraints around how they framed this, and the focus on big advances and monopsony, I think, was a calculated gamble that the only way an antitrust case could have even been built, it needed to kind of have, the defense kind of said, oh, it's this artificial construction, you're using publishers marketplace, or you're using random kind of denotation of the market. But I feel like all the really compelling arguments against the merger are capitalism 101 and would never justify, like, oh, people are going to get laid off. A lot of authors will have less places to go. Who cares? That's business as usual. Throughout the trial, I think every publisher, both the PRH and SNS representatives and publishers from the other companies, made it clear that kind of the publishing business is a crapshoot. P&Ls are wishful thinking, advances are arbitrary. And the judge poked holes in a lot of the defense's financial guesstimates, completely throwing out their analysis of the impact of the merger. And then in the closing argument, I think the DOJ gave a passing mention to the merger leading to less diverse books and new voices that will never get heard. And I'm hoping that the judge connects those dots in making her final decision, because on the face of just the advances, I think it's a 50-50 shot.
Howard, welcome back.
Sorry about that.
I hopped over to Guy to start us off here. Are you ready to jump in on the question of whether or not you think the government made its case on the 250,000 front?
That question specifically, I don't think so. I think the mystery of the lawsuit was sort of that industry people felt a little that was arbitrary, was that $250,000 figure. And if you look at some of the testimony from the insiders and the agents, I don't think they've made the case for that. I think they made the case for some other things related to the idea of consolidation and the disadvantages of that. But it was, that was the one thing that I think everybody I talked to thought was odd, was the sense of the 250 and where that came from.
And to the extent you're comfortable commenting on this, because I know your colleague was a witness in this case, do you see or anticipate any harm to your authors should the merger go through, or to how you run business?
It will affect things, but I think that there's an alternative to this. If it doesn't go through, that would affect us as well. So I think that, if Simon & Schuster sells to a private equity company and to an outsider that is not immersed in the culture of publishing, I think there's a give and take on everything. So I don't think that there are many people who are sort of active agents or people in Simon & Schuster who are opposed to this necessarily. I think that this was a long time coming, and I think that there's instability enough in the industry that having a PRH take over SNS seemed like the only logical thing within the publishing universe.
And can you comment more on what you mean by that instability?
I think part of this has to do with some of the testimony that came through and some of the questioning. It just I took some notes here. I mean, I think that it was clear from some of the executive testimony that publishing really is sort of this arbitrary, or as my partner who testified as an agent, Gail Ross of this agency, said that publishing business is an oxymoron, and that it is really difficult to make money. And so these big publishers are taking big shots, but for the most part, they're losing on them. I think Madeline Morell McIntosh, who is the CEO of Penguin Random House USA, testified in court that out of 100 books, about 35 of them make a profit. And out of that, only like 4% of that will actually be a big breakout. So it's there's a New Yorker article that came out this week talking about publishing as art or commerce. And I think that's always been the struggle here, to understand the kind of industry we're in, and it's both at the same time.
Yeah. MJ or our two Anns, do you want to jump in on this question?
Well, a lot of it will answer the question that you were going to ask me later, but I took some notes of some things that one of the questions you were going to ask me is how this is going to affect authors. And I think that there were a lot of things that came out that really aren't news, but they were things we all know and we all believe and we're all waiting to hear. And I think the art versus commerce part of the business were a lot of those notes. And one of them, I'll just go out of order here, but when Karp was asked how marketing budgets were set, he said, we often decide late in the process after we have heard the reactions from readers. In fact, literary agents frequently ask us to guarantee marketing dollars, and we don't do it because we don't want to be locked into a plan when we acquire the book. And without going into a long description, which most of you know anyway, of how word of mouth builds and how word of mouth is so important to books, this new way of marketing books, which is let's wait and see, which has gotten worse and worse over the last 10 years, is basically helping authors commit suicide, because you can't wait that long on every book. That's not how word of mouth builds. And so things like that came out weren't directly related to the question you're asking, but I think that they expose things about the industry that really are frightening and are that instability that we're talking about.
Yeah.
When I was, so I'm an author and not an agent, and I know about publishing from that aspect of it. So when I was reading about it, I had to keep reminding myself that this isn't the DOJ, like the parents trying to fix a broken child. Like, I had to stay focused on that this was an antitrust suit and not related to, talking about all of the problems in publishing and trying to fix those, because my reactions sometimes were not related at all to this is an antitrust suit. So, and I think probably that's very common for some of the other people that are in the same kind of position that I am. And one of the things so whenever I would start listening to the defense on the Penguin Random House side, I was frustrated by the idea that their case was built on, well, we're bumblers and we don't know anything. And from my perspective, and the careers that I've been in prior to writing, there was no time ever I was able to call myself a bumbler, say, oh, well, and still collect a salary. So, or even run a business for that matter. So it's a little, since I wasn't there to hear how it was said or whether in context, I was able to respond in whatever outraged way I wanted to. And in some ways I felt pretty upset about that. So, and then there was I'll say one more thing, and that is, there was the comment about that the Penguin Random House are angel investors, and that made me unhappy because I'm not looking for an angel investor to make my dreams come true. I created something that I'm selling, and I really don't want anybody's angel thoughts around my product. And that felt to me a little bit more like taking the idea that we're a business and we're an art, and really conflating those two things in a way that I did not like. So, so from just my perspective, just out of context, I had some pretty strong feelings about it.
Auntie, did you want to get in anything?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just follow up the other Anne. I'm a publisher of a small press, and it's got to be a business, or else I'm not a publisher of a small press. I mean, I make my living and the business exists because people buy books. So I think this art commerce thing is really, it's true and it's interesting, but ultimately publishing is a business. Mm-hmm. You have to bring in money. I can't risk, the kinds of money that, that Penguin Random House can risk on books, because I don't have the resources that they do. So there's, it'd be interesting to have conversations about different kinds of commerce, and different levels of commerce, and not just art versus commerce, mm-hmm. But conglomerates versus non-conglomerates. So yeah, I guess I just want to reiterate that, yeah, it's a business. There's a lot of crapshoot involving in deciding that a manuscript that comes in will sell X number of copies in 3 years. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean, nobody in publishing can know what they're doing. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think Howard referred to this issue earlier. Let's say the judge rules in favor of the government, the acquisition is stopped. Everything we know at this point indicates Simon & Schuster will be sold off to somebody. It could go to another one of the big five, possibly. It could go to a private equity firm, and who knows. Guy, I was wondering if you could help us think through, is it a good thing if it goes to anyone but PRH, basically not increasing the size of that whale, or if there could in fact be a worse outcome if it goes to one of these other players?
Well, I think there's no question, a private equity owner, and I'm speaking from multiple personal experiences, disaster. It gets broken up for parts. The big four cherry pick the best of Simon & Schuster. And 5 years from now, we talk about Simon & Schuster as, used to be one of the big six. A shame what happened to them with that private equity deal. That's just how private equity works. Any of the other big four, I think HarperCollins was the number 2 bidder by a far margin, because that's how much money PRH has. HarperCollins gets them, all right, so now we have a big 2. The construct of the big 5 has never made sense to me anyway. Like, how do you leave Scholastic out, who's bigger than Macmillan and almost as big as Simon & Schuster, but they're not the big 5, I guess, because they're kids and they've got the book fair business. So, what's interesting about Howard's comment about the instability of the industry, I forget how much money Karp is going to get if this deal goes through. There's your instability in the industry. These executives who under oath basically said, we don't really know what we're doing. It's art, it's commerce. Aren't we cool? They're doing fine. They're not unstable. Simon & Schuster had a huge year last year with a profitable year. So these are profitable conglomerates, excuse me, that aren't in trouble. Viacom just has decided publishing isn't important in their media ecosystem. So
I would dispute that. Macmillan has been reportedly on the selling block for years now. It is not a profitable business. Part of the big problem here that we haven't talked about is that publishers don't have relationships with book buyers, the booksellers do. And it's much harder to figure out how to sell to your audience if you don't have a relationship with them. So they have relationships with bookstores, but not the actual readers. They've tried to get smarter about it, but it is very, yeah, I agree. It's frustrating to see, but I think, you know, you have to think about the big three, not the big five, because if it's not Penguin Random House, Simon Schuster is already one of the big five. Macmillan's not going to bid. Harper's bid is lower. Viacom CBS is going to look for the best bidder or the biggest bidder because they want to make some money on this. So it's going to go somewhere else. And I think that there is that danger. And I think that, yeah, I mean, life is good for a lot of these imprints and a lot of these publishers. They're all doing the best they can. But I think that, you know, there is this sense, there's a stress and anxiety about the industry, even though numbers disprove that. And we're seeing, I think what this is showing more than anything is this disparity that is happening everywhere in the world. The winners are taking all and everybody else is struggling. And I think that that is a trend that's happening in every part of the entertainment sector and other sectors of industry. And we have to address that in addition to figuring out what's going to happen here.
Just want to clarify one thing. I didn't say Macmillan was profitable. I said Macmillan was smaller than Scholastic. Simon & Schuster, as of 2020, had a great 2021.
My objection was you saying everything was peachy.
No, I think just broadly speaking,
yeah,
the executives are not unstable. Yeah, Macmillan maybe a little bit because they've had a lot of executive turnover as arguably a reflection of their inability to transition as the market has changed. 100% agree with you that at the end of the day, publishing's biggest problem, big publishing, is its inability to engage directly with readers. They're reliant on an old infrastructure that still by and large supports them and allows them to take these big bets that fail. I forget which, they didn't name the book, but there was some Simon & Schuster book that they projected, I think, $1 million in sales and got 200,000. It was some like they missed it by a mile. Like, how do you miss that bad and still have a job kind of thing?
That's endemic. I mean, that's constant. Paying too much and making nothing back. And so is the not engaging with the readers, which a lot of us who've been in this landscape since 2000 have been screaming that Amazon engages with readers and publishers have to engage with readers. And every effort they've made has been abysmal. And a lot of small publishers, I'm also a small publisher, have figured out how to engage with readers, and it's a world of difference. It's inexcusable that the big guys have not figured this out yet. Inexcusable.
I mean, I keep hearing that various initiatives at these companies to build email newsletter lists, to focus more on digital marketing, to, you know, change the direction of the ship. Is that just really a drop in the bucket? It's not doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, and I think this was something the defense argued that I think is true. Eliminate all the big one concerns. Is PRH the best home for Simon & Schuster? Probably, because PRH, more than any of the big five, has a really strong consumer marketing operation. And again, it goes to the rich get richer. They've invested in it. They've got the ability to, everything that people in my realm on the marketing side are like, oh, why don't publishers do more of this, X, Y, Z? PRH is pretty much, I'll give them credit, has nailed most of it as well as any conglomerate can. Does it mean every one of their books is going to be a bestseller? Absolutely not. But I do agree that antitrust issues aside, is PRH probably the best home for Simon & Schuster in terms of being able to support books better than other big fives? I think that's true. That doesn't, in my mind, justify it happening and creating a big one.
I just have to say what they've done is a drop in the bucket. What they do with their direct consumer is bombarding the same readers over and over and over with too many books. And at the same time, I mean, I see the marketing plans for so many books and lots that are over the $250,000 threshold. And it's astonishing from every house how often these marketing plans are based on nothing, basically, on freebies that are just not going to move the needle. But that's another topic for another event.
Well,
That's the quantity over quality argument in terms of volume of books.
yeah. I mean, my comments again are not necessarily based in this idea of the antitrust suit, but I do, I do have to laugh a little bit when we say that Penguin Random House is probably the best one that does the best job. Well, I've been published by both Penguin Random House and also Simon and Schuster, and now I'm with Lake Union, and there's a reason for that. I think that there's tons of innovation to happen, and the kinds of things that the traditional publishers are doing is not innovative, and the kinds of things they're doing to get new readership is, for the most part, kind of, it's a little lazy. It's kind of drop in the bucket kind of stuff, and I think that, to be a good literary citizen and to be of the good business, I think that if you're trying to sell to readers and you're not working hard to find readers, then yeah, it's going to be a big crapshoot about what book does well and what book doesn't do well. And when people are napping and didn't get to see that book, or when people are wide awake, because it comes down to these very small kinds of things that in the end, are problematic. And if we're talking about it being a monopoly and those large advances, whether that was a good argument or not, there's always going to be a trickle down to the people who started their publishing career with an advance of $2,000, knowing full well that there was going to be no support for them whatsoever. And that's the ending of their career. So it's a little bit tough sometimes for those of us that have come from zero and have tried to find these readers on our own, to have the big publisher do this. I just think it's very, and then to suggest that the author was the problem and didn't have enough large of a platform, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, and that's what I mean when I say that it's hard for me not to listen to a conversation about the DOJ and publishing and not feel like finally mom and dad got told some stuff and there's going to be some things happening. So it gives me a chance to sort of air my grievances, even though they're not really in alignment with what they were studying at the DOJ. So, whether they're the right home or not, it could be the right home, but I think that the homes need a little work before we feel good about anybody becoming a monopoly of any sort.
I just want to add, I agree with everybody on this position. I will say the publishers are much better at marketing things now than they used to be. The publicity side is the same thing, but there are imprints that have tools that they didn't have before, and they're trying. Yes. Right. So that's an improvement. However, part of the disparity in these advances, and you see these wild advances that are being thrown out. 250 is actually not a wildly high advance these days, but part of it is that the publishers want, as Anne said, bring your platform in, we'll overpay you, you pay for a publicist on the outside to help, because we need that help. And I think that is a concession that publishers have made in sort of this deal that's that's understood. We'll give you a little extra money, you help us out when you sell the book.
There's some discussion in the chat. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead, MJ.
It's really important, and being in regular advertising as well as publishing now. Michael said that Penguin said that their marketing spend was 2% of their revenues, which is roughly 55 million marketing spend on an annual sales of about $2.7 billion. There is no industry that I work for, and I worked for Sharp Electronics, a beer company, a bank, Maidenform bras, Charles Lawrence perfumes. Nobody spent 2% of what they were making on the marketing. I mean, that is so low and so ridiculous to think that that's going to accomplish what you need to accomplish. I had missed that in all the write-ups, and I'm just so outraged by it. It's insane.
I think that 2% of marketing needs context as well, because what that means is a significant percentage of books got 0% in marketing. how do they account for marketing? A lot of those internal channels aren't counted as marketing spend, but count as marketing. And there are plenty of industries, I've worked in them, where 2% is like, wow, thank you for that much money, because most industries treat marketing as an expense rather than an investment.
I can simplify this for you. $55 million in marketing. Penguin Random House has more than 110 books that deserve $500,000 in marketing each and probably get it. Or let's say 200 books that each got, I mean, again, it's not a marketing conversation, but $55 million, even among your best sellers, isn't significant. You know, when you look at how
It depends on where you're spending that money. Again, I think the problem with Big Five
Facebook ads is the average these days. So
the problem with Big Five conversations is it so narrows the focus to the most generalist side of the market and ignores that there are successful publishers outside of the Big Five that didn't get discussed in this conversation because they don't pay $250,000 in advances. And even, I forget who it was, admitted some $1 million book got $35,000 in marketing because they were relying on the author's platform. So I think we just have to be, and you know, I'm the last one to defend any Big Five publisher, but I think we have to be careful about generalist statements without context. And that 2% in my mind didn't have context because I don't believe it included what they consider their in-house marketing, their various mailing lists, the catalogs, the bookseller relationships, and all that stuff. I think paid marketing is not always the answer.
Howard, did you have something?
No, I think that's the right way to think about it. And I think that again, we're dealing with a really we're dealing with a creative process. It's different with fiction that where you have the final product and the finished product, and you can figure out what kind of campaign should we use to launch. But there are times, because I engage in nonfiction, adult nonfiction, in what I represent. And when you sell a book on a proposal, you don't know what the final product's going to be. Sometimes it's incredible and it's so much better, and the publisher will see that and think, well, we're going to back that. And that's no different than any other industry. I mean, if you're in the music industry, you have somebody and they start picking up, you know, streaming plays on Spotify, you're going to put more money on that person because you think you can make up the difference on the losses that you have. But with nonfiction, you could outperform the expectation or underperform. And if you're underperforming, I've seen, you know, or if you're a problematic author, I've seen this with clients, like there's a decision of like, we're just going to let this one go. We're going to move on. That's equally frustrating. That's a totally different thing. But again, this reinforces the idea that we're dealing with things that are not widgets. They are products of creative endeavors. And because of that, we just don't know how they're going to land with the audience. We don't know how they're going to land with your editor, whatnot. So it's very hard to make scientific predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, going back to advances, which the case hinges on, whether the advances go up or down on the top anticipated sellers. How much do you think the outcome of this trial will matter to, let's call that, say, the average author? Not that there is any such thing as an average, but something that struck me from the testimony, and I hope I'm getting this right, is that if you set the framework properly, like if you look at the Penguin Random House merger that happened in 2013, and you look at the advances before that point and then after that point, as I understand it, the advances actually looked okay, either flat or maybe increased, if you were getting an advance below that $250,000 threshold. It was the advances beyond that threshold that came down. And I believe that came out of either Dr. Hill or Dr. Snyder's testimony. They're the economists that each side hired to make the case. So that was a kind of an eye-opener to me, since most of the authors I deal with in daily life are not getting those big six-figure advances. And it sort of made clear why the government might be focusing on the framework that would give it the best shot, obviously. MJ, do you want to comment on this particular aspect?
Yeah, so much of it is going to depend on if the merger happens, how the imprints deal with each other. Because I know that for most mid-list authors that I'm aware of, and I guess a lot of them, advances have come down in the last 5 years significantly, especially in the last, say, 3 years. A lot of authors who are getting 100 went to 75, 75 went to 50. A lot more publishers were quoting real P&Ls and really looking at sales and putting a lot less optimism behind the new advances, especially with house authors. I think that it's just logical that if there are less imprints, and there are going to be less imprints. I mean, Random House is not going to keep, Penguin's not going to keep all the imprints at Simon & Schuster, and there will be less. And every agent that I've talked to in the last 5 years has complained that there are less imprints, and that means there are less, the advances are going down for everybody. I know the advances have gone down also for people above 250, but again, every time I've heard about this, and again, it's anecdotal, but it's been dozens and dozens of people, it's because it's based on sales. I mean, more than ever, that's what I'm hearing from agents and authors is, I got an offer, but they looked at my last sales and they really are adhering to those numbers now. Whereas 5 years ago or longer, somebody would say, well, yes, that's for her sales, but we can do a better job. And I'm just not hearing that. So I'm assuming, based on reading everything that I read, that you can't guess what the answer to this is until you really know what they're going to do with the imprints and the bidding against each other. Or, I mean, well, it's too anecdotal, but I know in a recent situation with an author who's a client of mine who was turned down by their longtime imprint at Penguin Random, longtime imprint, 10 books all earned out, and for whatever reason was turned down, wanted to go to another imprint. The other imprint was interested, and there was a phone call behind the scenes from the one imprint to the other, which was, we don't want you to take them because the sales force said blah, blah, blah. That's not an outright competition thing, but that's going to happen. I mean, we know that's going to happen. They're going to make the phone calls. The sales force is going to be the same. And that sales force isn't going to want to sell an author from a different imprint, even if it was at Simon & Schuster and now it's at Penguin. So I think it's going to be severe.
Well, that's chilling.
There was
the voice of doom.
I just had to take a minute there.
There was a question that maybe touches on this a little bit that Howard offered an answer to. Someone's saying they were reading through the trial recaps.
Yeah, perfect.
And they got the sense that publishers view their imprints as essentially small presses with their own budgets, their own marketing decisions, these little fiefdoms. And so they're wondering how much it really matters if the companies merge, if all of the imprints have this autonomy. Is it true they have autonomy to make these decisions? I mean, I know the defense was certainly making that case that there would be competition because, PRH allows its imprints to bid it.
That way, but the sales force is still the sales force. Yeah. And the sales force is as strong a voice now in an acquisition as the editors, and I love all these people. They're all individually wonderful people, but the sales force is going to say, I mean, we know what's going on with Barnes and Noble now, where they're not taking all the front list books anymore. The sales force is going to say, you may love the book, but we can't sell her. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter how strong, and a lot of the situations that I'm hearing about are with senior editors, where authors are leaving or not being asked to stay, with very senior editors.
Mm-hmm. So switching gears, and there's already
one second. I'm curious. I want to ask an awkward question, but I think for our audience, an appropriate one. And Howard and Ann T, I'm curious your take. The focus on advances is interesting, and MJ made a really important point there. Some of the impact on the size of advances is less about relationships and your Andrew Wiley's being able to swing a good deal, and increasingly is about what were your past sales. How much of this advanced discussion is actually valid, and how much is missing the point that well, your advances are lower because the sale, for whatever reason, now publishers not marketing is part of it, but how much of this got overlooked in the conversation, and is it an important factor or not?
I mean, we talked earlier, I think Howard made the point that, you know, most books lose money, right? And the system is built on this sort of risk taking, right? You're just gonna throw a bunch of money at a bunch of different books and hope that 1 out of 5, you know, sells enough to cover the losses for the rest. And at the same time, we're talking about how advances are important and advances should stay high. If you're trying to think about like just numbers, it doesn't work. You can't just have low sales and high advances and have the numbers work. And this is why when you get into, you know, these conglomerate publishing, it gets lost. You know, someone like me who is actually trying to make a living based on how much money comes in and how much money I can give out, I can't give a $20,000 advance if a book's going to sell 1,000 copies. To use very small numbers based on what, you know, this trial is doing, it doesn't work. If sales are high, then the author gets a lot of money. And so I know that this, you know, the trial was based on this idea of advances. And I think it's so good that so many people are learning more about publishing through this trial. But I really wish we could talk about sales, because it's the sales of books. That's where the money comes back to the publishers. And I certainly am not arguing that authors should get less money, period. No. But, you know, if we could have discussions of how much did an author make, period, on royalties. Advances are just one subset of royalties that are paid out before. So if we take royalties instead of advances and start looking at how things are working, I think we would get a better understanding of the business of publishing. It doesn't answer any of the questions about the trial or Big Five or anything, but it does help people understand the business.
I want to talk about two things. One, based on what Anne just talked about, that and also what MJ said before with somebody she knows. I think it's very different with fiction, with people who have a lot of books under their belt. In book selling, you know, we've heard the story many times where there's an independent bookstore or a chain or something, and they, like, your favorite indie store sells 10 copies of your client's book, and they make a decision that that's all they're going to ever sell. So they don't reorder, because bookshelf space is valuable, and they don't think that even if they sell 2 or 3 more copies, it's not worth that reorder, and they just move on. It's incredibly frustrating. We have no control over it, but there's a sense of like finitude, or just, you know, the completeness with this thing. I will say though that you know, in our experience, advances are going up because these big publishers, instead of playing the $1 blackjack table, they have to play the $5 or the $10 blackjack table. So they have to gamble big because they need to make more money. It's a better business for agents. It's not necessarily better for authors, or like every author, or for publishers. But, you know, I'll give you 2 examples, very specific examples, where I had a nonfiction author whose first book didn't do that well. She didn't even get an offer from her existing publisher for her next proposal. I went and sold that proposal for $500,000. She had like 15,000 copies of her sold in her first book. The second idea was so good. I had, you know, multi-publisher preemptive offer, sold for $500,000. I have another client who I've worked with for 15 years. His first book was a university press, and we just kept building him up. His publisher was not a Big Five publisher, made a $40,000 offer. We felt it was too low, and I had an auction for his book with multiple publishers at different Big Five, and I ended up selling it for $280,000. So, you know, it is possible. His sales track wasn't that great, but this new book idea was so good. He had been building this platform. So there is hope in sort of getting that sort of second push or third push for your career. A lot of it depends on, you know, do you have a great product that you're trying to sell? Do you have somebody who's really good at selling it? So I remain optimistic about it, but I have a biased view from where I'm.
No, you're right. It's a nonfiction fiction difference. There definitely is. I should have
And
clarified.
I don't know if this is adding to the conversation or not, but because I have always had very low advances, I am not in the realm of the kinds of things that you're talking about. Like, it's much different for me. And so because of that, I've always had 2 or 3 jobs sometimes while I'm writing and trying to make a career work. So for me, the advance has always been less even important to me. And what I've always used sort of as what I really want is readers. That's what I want. And I know that in the future, my success as a fiction writer will hinge on those readers, whether it's in a platform or whatever, and building my career is all about those readers. So to Anne's point, when she was saying, I think we need to talk about, whatever the advances and the royalties, for me, the actual number that I'm interested in is the number of readers that I can put in front of so that they will be excited about me and the next book will be excited about me, and on and on and on. So I don't even, it's because money hasn't been part of my story much. I had to find another thing where I could hang my hat on it, and it really became numbers of readers. And so getting that piece of it is a more important piece of it than I don't quit my day job. And most of the writers that I talk to don't quit their day jobs unless they're independently wealthy or married in a way that allows them to be a writer. But since I'm not any of those things, I continue to work. And so the number that I'm most interested in is who is going to give me the readers? Who am I going to get in front of? And I would think that that's not an unusual place to be. So, and sometimes when I was listening to them and reading about the trial, I was thinking those numbers and the money stuff doesn't build an argument for me in a way that I can even get around or understand. That it always comes around to the same thing. It's like, is this monopoly, or is it going to be something that the money is not the bottom line for me? It's the number of readers. So in some ways, that would have been a point that would have spoken to me more clearly or better.
So a good deal of the defense's case attempted to demonstrate there's meaningful competition in the market that could compete against a combined PRH, Simon & Schuster. And it came to light that Penguin Random House lost some market share over the years, depending on how you measure that, after the 2013 merger, which would lend some credence to that. What do you think? And I'll start with Ann T.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I don't understand the industry on this level as well as some of the other panelists. So I definitely want to hear what they have to say about, the market, losing market share, potential of that. I think some people could lose their jobs. I think that's an important thing that we, should remember, is that it's not just a company up for sale, but it's people who work there. And I think that's really important to always keep in mind. I think it's also market share. Again, I'd love to hear what, some of the people who understand the industry better might have to say, where does market share come from, and is just, the difference between 2 of the big 5. Gia's been talking about, there's a lot of other really large publishers out there that don't get counted in the big 5. So, how does the market share change if you're looking at it from that broader perspective, as well as changes in the market per se, and book buying habits and bestsellers of the year. So it didn't work for me, that argument from the defense.
Going back to fiction a little bit and market share, the self-publishing was mentioned briefly throughout the trial, but the romance industry is one that I have a lot of facts about. And an enormous part of the romance writers have left traditional publishing to go to either small presses or to be indie or to even be hybrid. And I know that at a lot of Penguin Random imprints, especially like Berkeley, for instance, that had a very robust romance market, they cut their authors like crazy. And a lot of publishers have had to, because once you go indie, you can price your books correctly in correctly meaning that that's the price a reader wants. They want it to be $6.99 or less. And Amazon can price it at that. And the readers, while they're discerning and they like their favorite authors, there are a lot of authors out there. The average romance reader reads over 100 books a year. And if A author is $11.99 and B author is $4.99 or in KU, that reader is not that discerning in that moment that she won't move to the KU or $4.99 book and wait till the $11.99 one comes into BookBub, because readers are really smart. And basically, I think the biggest reason that market share has dropped is the number of indie authors who've left. I mean, we know from just looking at the list right now, look at Colleen Hoover, 7 places on the list for the last, I don't know how many weeks. That's a huge amount of market share when you start losing your romance readers. So I think that between KU and BookBub, which the only number they ever mentioned that I'm aware of was about 3 years ago, they said they'd sold 50 million books through BookBub. A lot of those are indie and small press. So between BookBub and KU and the romance industry, that alone could account for market share, for publishers losing market share. In just, I'm not a scientist about this, but I've been watching that. So that seems like a possible reason. And that's only going to get worse, because the more there are ways for authors to publish hybrid or self-publish or indie or small presses that help them, they're going to do it, because you can reach your readers and you can offer them books at a price that the big publishers insist is too low.
I think for me, the definition of the market was probably one of the slipperiest aspects of the trial, that there was no ultimate agreement around. There was the 91% of the market that the big 5 has, but that market is the anticipated bestsellers. That there's the projected 50% of the market, a combined PRH, Simon & Schuster would have. To MJ's point, what market is that? Because nobody knows what Amazon is selling between just straight up direct sales of self-published books, what's happening in these subscription platforms. One of the mentioned things in this was the distribution side of the business, which is big for PRH and Simon & Schuster. Part of the reason Simon & Schuster had such a good year last year was the growth on the distribution side, specifically of manga, specifically of Viz, a publisher neither of them own, but that they both benefit from. PRH for the past 2 years has been ramping up their distribution business on the comic side. Simon & Schuster already had a pretty solid comics distribution business. That's another part of the market that generally is not acknowledged being part of the publishing market at all. Comics kind of exist sometimes, I feel like, at a lower level even than self-publishing. But if you think about it, the big 5 really only exists because of consolidation. So this market share is a fake point of reference anyway, because they don't grow organically. PRH has acknowledged they've had no organic growth over the past 10 years. It's been the acquisition of Random House. My guess is whether or not this goes through. Remember, they have a 50% stake in Sourcebooks, which is one of the biggest mid-sized publishers, not mentioned in this conversation at all. If this deal doesn't go through, I bet they acquire the rest of that and buy Sourcebooks out. Or they're waiting to do it until the deal goes through to not further add to the argument of they're too big. So I think the definition of the market is really tricky and can be spun for whichever argument you want to make.
I think that's a really great point. It was hard to juggle all those numbers. And it feels like at times, even the witnesses testifying were getting their own numbers wrong. Okay, so there's a question that's come through where it was mentioned by a PRH exec, the top dog, that he felt the biggest threat to the business is in fact subscription models. And this of course points to Kindle Unlimited, which MJ brought up, and there's Scribd and Storytel in Europe. Simon & Schuster participates in subscription models. PRH more or less tries not to, stays out of it. So the questioner is wondering how important is that in the trial? My takeaway was that it wasn't important, but anyone want to tackle that?
I mean, as someone who works for a subscription-based business, I don't think it was relevant in the context of the trial at all, in the same way so many other small important factors weren't relevant in the trial. At the end of the day, to me, that's just more a reflection of typical publishing. There are alternative business models that big publishers tend to resist until either they have no choice, or they die out and they prove they were correct to be able to ignore them. At the end of the day, subscription models, fighting against them, you're fighting against consumer preference. Same way fighting against library access is fighting against consumer preference. A combined company, though, could potentially delay the success of a subscription model business or accelerate it in other markets as publishers who are willing to play in it take advantage of it.
I think that the question about this subscription issue brings up a larger point about this entire lawsuit and the defense, which is that it all feels a little, to those of us in the industry, a little bit this sort of focus on prestige publishing, which is the most glamorous and most visible type of publishing, but most of us know it's not the backbone of the business. The backlists and the other. I think there was one testimony that talked about children's books being 27% of the revenue for Penguin Random House, and they barely talked about children's books. But they can trot out Stephen King, and the defense can trot out these big name agents, and it's what everybody thinks about, but it's not the reality. And I think that this whole lawsuit was sort of focused on the things that were more visible and a little bit blingier. And that's sort of forced both sides to come up with arguments that some of us don't feel ring true to the whole space.
It was the first time I ever heard about a glam budget being in a contract. For those who didn't hear about that, this is, I guess, some sort of clause that mandates the publisher pay for like makeup and wardrobe for appearances. That was a new one for me. Have you had one of those in your contracts, Howard?
Thankfully, no. not even brown M&Ms. So.
We have just a few minutes left. Was there something that came out of the trial testimony that surprised you or will definitely stay with you, like the glam budgets? It could be relevant, funny, serious, whatever you prefer. And I'll start with Anne. Garvin.
I probably already shoot my shot on the angel investors thing because I was so annoyed when I saw it that so I couldn't help but say that right away. But I think my biggest thing really was a surprise that they came at it like we're bumblers and we don't know what we're doing, because I felt that was sort of disingenuous. And I was like, are you even taking it seriously? Like, are you saying that out loud? Because I felt like that was kind of it just felt wrong. And it may, again, it's one of those probably taken out of context and somebody said it and then they put it all and you see it everywhere instead of all, the 300 pages that Howard read that was not.
No, but that's Marcus Dole. He's sort of Panglossian and all this stuff. He has a reputation for really, and he even said he's an optimist in this. I just want to say, just my last whatever parting words is that some of the testimony was cringy for sure, and it sort of exposed the paradox of publishing as a business and how it's run. And at the same time, these are my people and you are my people. And like, I love book culture, and I'm glad we're not operated by suits and private equity who demand a bottom line. I think that the publishers at these imprints are given some room and some, and they make mistakes and they overpay and they do all these things, but ultimately they all love books and we all want authors to get discovered and books to get published. So, this whole thing exposed the imperfect business that we're in, but I wouldn't want to be in any other.
Yeah, I agree with that. I always say that you have to, as an author, from the author's point of view, to be an author, you have to be an optimist, to believe that what you have to say is important enough to put down on paper. And then you have to become a pessimist, because publishing is not an art or a business, it's both. And so it's just the reality of it. And for me, the surprise wasn't really a surprise, but it was that really came out, that it really is an art and it's a business. And that's really the truth of it. And as an author, That's always been so important to me, that I've had editors and publishers who've believed in my art, even if they couldn't make a book into a successful business. And as a marketing person, it's not the people that, it's not a marketing person who doesn't want to try. Everybody wants to try so hard, and everybody in publishing is so frustrated when things don't go well. The biggest problem is not that the people in marketing and PR don't want to get marketing and PR. It's that there's so little PR left to get. As Howard said in the beginning, the problems, and this really came out for me in the trial, the problems are the way the whole world is getting smaller, and only the big are floating to the top.
I think for me, the thing that less a surprise, but was surprised to see it put out so plainly. I don't know if you guys remember a few years ago, Payless, the shoe store company, did a whole marketing stunt around, it was Payless, and they called it Paylessy, and invited all these influencers and pretended that these were like designer shoes, and the prices were like $700-800. They did this whole thing, and then the reveal was these are Payless shoes, they're $20. And they're like, oh my God, I had no idea. That was the trial to me. It exposed the big five as Payless. They're no better than the other publishers they compete against, other than in some cases they have deeper pockets. But the editorial expertise, you can get that at any mid-sized small publisher. You might even get more attention because they've got a more focused, tighter list. So I think the surprising thing was that under oath, the big five in particular revealed itself to not actually be that big a deal.
That was also one of my main takeaways, is that I didn't even think I would be following this trial in my capacity as a publisher of an independent press, because I just thought this is just a totally different world. And then I'm everything they're talking about is all the stuff I think about and work on every day. I was like, wow, that's just the same thing. And I just didn't see that coming.
There was a question in the chat, I think from Jennifer. She felt like a lot of the trial testimony and the models being discussed wasn't maybe material to a lot of working authors. And I think everyone is maybe with the exception of Howard. I don't know, I feel like the two Anns have touched on it, Guy has touched on it. Does anyone want to push back against that? I mean, MJ, I think you said pretty clearly you think authors are going to be hurt because imprints will be eliminated.
Distribution is a huge part of getting your book out there. I mean, as a small publisher, we went to Simon & Schuster as our distributor, and it's amazing what they're able to do. So I think that one of the things that wasn't discussed as much as it should have been is that distribution is a huge part of success, and Penguin Random already has the best distribution. And a lot of authors I know, this came up in the trial, you don't always do things because of the advance you're being offered. There are other reasons to go to a house. And one of the reasons that you would choose Penguin Random House over another one of the big five or anybody else is the distribution model. And so I think that the fact that if they merge, that distribution model is going to become so powerful. This came up a lot in the trial, but it's not very sexy for anybody to talk about it. But from my point of view, it's such an enormous, important part of everything that I wish it had been a bigger part of the conversation.
In addition to that, MJ, like this past year, Simon & Schuster had to move 1 million copies of books because it had printing issues, because we have supply, everybody knows that there's some crazy supply issues with publishing and with printing. And Penguin Random House doesn't have that because they have printers. They have, they control their own printing. Right. Simon & Schuster outsources it. These are factors that we don't talk about, but we have to deal with, because I had 3 clients whose books got bumped because there's literally a ship coming from China to the US and it takes 3 months for that ship to get here. And so you have to delay the book. So there are all these extra factors, but I mean, I think that going back to what Jennifer asked, the fundamental, this is the first question of the talk, the fundamental argument they built this around was kind of ridiculous. This has to do with anticipated top-selling books. And they put this $250,000 mark on that. And, the majority of people who aspire to write are not going to get that amount. And it's is it relevant? I feel like there are grounds for this whole monopsony argument, but to build it around that level and to exclude everything else, maybe that was the play they thought they could run with. But that, I think by virtue of that, just that premise excludes 99% of the people who want to write.
I think we're going to let Howard have the last word on that. I think that's excellent. Thank you all for joining me here today, both the panelists and the attendees. And I realized I forgot to introduce our panelists at the top, so my apologies for that. I just find that you're all so well known. How could people not know exactly who you are? The recording of this conversation will be posted on YouTube at my channel, the Jane Friedman YouTube channel. The transcript will also be available as a link if you'd like to keep that for posterity. So thank you all once again. I have so enjoyed this, and maybe we'll do this again after a decision is made and we can talk about the fallout. So
Thank you, Jane.
Great.
Fine.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jane.
everybody.
And thanks.
have a great afternoon.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.